Hey there. Tonight, we drift into the shadowed world of feudal Japan, where beneath the glittering facade of silk kimonos and painted faces lay a reality far more complex and troubling than the romanticized tales would have us believe. The Geisha, those enigmatic figures who seem to float through history like graceful spirits, carried burdens that modern eyes can barely comprehend. Their lives, woven from threads of artistry and servitude, beauty and suffering, revealed truths about a society that demanded perfection while offering little in return. As we peel back the layers of myth and mystique, we discover a world where young girls were sold into bondage, where freedom was a luxury few could afford, and where the pursuit of aesthetic perfection came at a cost that echoed through entire lifetimes. So dim the lights, settle into comfort, and let us journey together into this forgotten realm where dreams and nightmares danced hand in hand. In the mist-shrouded villages of feudal Japan, where rice paddies stretched like mirrors beneath gray skies and wooden houses huddled together against the bitter winds, families faced choices that would haunt them through countless sleepless nights. The harvest had failed again, as it so often did in those unforgiving years, and the sound of empty rice bowls echoed through homes where children's laughter had grown thin and hollow. Fathers would sit in torch-lit rooms, their weathered hands trembling as they counted meager coins that would never be enough, while mothers wept silently into rough hemp sleeves, knowing that love alone could not fill empty stomachs or pay the mounting debts that pressed upon them like stones upon the chest. As winter's cruel embrace tightened around these desperate households, whispered conversations would begin in shadowed corners, words spoken so softly they seemed to dissolve into the incense-heavy air. The representatives from the flower and willow districts would arrive like phantoms in the night, their silk garments rustling with promises of salvation wrapped in sorrow. They spoke of opportunities in distant cities, of daughters who could bring honor and prosperity to families drowning in poverty, their voices smooth as polished jade yet cold as mountain streams. These merchants of human dreams would lay out small fortunes before families who had not seen such wealth in generations, the silver coins glinting like tears in the lamplight, while parents wrestled with decisions that would reshape the very fabric of their souls. The moment of transaction carried with it the weight of eternity, as small hands were placed into the grasp of strangers, while mothers turned their faces away, unable to witness the final severing of bonds that had been woven from birth. Little girls, some barely old enough to understand the meaning of goodbye, would be led away into the darkness, their small voices calling back to homes they would never see again, their childhood belongings reduced to a single bundle clutched against trembling chests. The families left behind would light incense at their household shrines, praying to ancestors for forgiveness, while the echo of departing footsteps faded into the night, like the last notes of a mournful song. Meanwhile, in the pleasure quarters of great cities, these daughters of desperation would begin their transformation from innocent children into living works of art, their former lives becoming distant memories that would fade like cherry blossoms in the rain. The gold that had seemed like salvation to their families would bind these young souls to years of service, creating chains more beautiful and terrible than any forged from iron, while the flower and willow world prepared to reshape them according to its ancient and unforgiving designs. Little did these families know that their acts of love and desperation would echo through the years, creating ripples of consequence that would touch generations yet unborn. Within the walls of the Okiya houses, where paper screens filtered pale morning light and the scent of sandalwood hung heavy in the air, a transformation began that would strip away every vestige of childhood with the precision of a master craftsman. The young girls who had arrived clutching memories of their former lives would find themselves thrust into a world where every natural impulse must be suppressed, every childish gesture replaced with movements of calculated grace. From the moment the temple bells announced the dawn, these small figures would be molded like clay in the hands of relentless teachers, their days measured not in play and laughter, but in endless repetitions of shamisen scales and dance steps that must be performed with absolute perfection. The Okasan, or house mother, ruled these domains with an authority that brooked no dissent, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she watched her charges struggle to master arts that had been refined over centuries. Each morning brought lessons that stretched from sunrise to well past sunset, with young hands bleeding from shamisen strings and feet blistered from dance practice, while instructors wielded bamboo switches that would snap against any limb that dared to move incorrectly. The girls learned to endure pain in silence, their faces maintaining the serene composure expected of their future profession, even as tears threatened to spill from eyes that had grown old before their time. Sleep became a precious commodity measured in hours stolen between lessons, and meals were often forgotten luxuries as the demands of training consumed every waking moment. Perhaps most cruel of all was the systematic erasure of personal identity that accompanied the physical training, as these young souls were taught to suppress their own desires and opinions until they became perfect mirrors, reflecting only what others wished to see. Their given names were replaced with artistic appellations that belonged to the house rather than to themselves, while their natural speech patterns were refined and polished until every word emerged with the calculated beauty of poetry. The Okiya mothers understood that to create the perfect geisha, they must first destroy the child completely, leaving only a foundation upon which to build their living masterpieces. Friendships between the girls were discouraged, for emotional bonds could interfere with the single-minded devotion required for their craft. As seasons turned and years passed within these cloistered walls, the transformation would gradually take hold, as spontaneous laughter gave way to practiced smiles and genuine emotions retreated behind masks of professional composure. The young women who emerged from this crucible bore little resemblance to the children who had entered, their grace purchased with the currency of lost innocence and their beauty refined through countless hours of suffering that would remain forever hidden beneath layers of white powder and rouge. Little did the outside world suspect that behind the mesmerizing performances lay years of systematic conditioning that had replaced childhood wonder with the cold precision of living art, creating beings who could enchant any audience while remaining forever strangers to themselves. In the shadowed chambers of the flower districts, where silk screens concealed transactions that would forever alter the course of young lives, a ceremony approached that marked the most profound violation of innocence disguised as tradition. The mizuage represented the culmination of years of preparation, when apprentice geisha would be transformed from maidens into fully realized entertainers through an act that reduced their most intimate essence to mere commodity. Wealthy patrons would bid astronomical sums for this privilege, their offers climbing ever higher as Okiya mothers calculated the precise moment when their investments would yield the greatest return. The girls themselves, having been prepared for this moment through years of conditioning, would face their fate with the same practiced composure they had learned to apply to every other aspect of their existence. The ritual surrounding this passage carried with it the weight of centuries, wrapped in ceremonial significance that sought to elevate what was essentially a transaction into something approaching the sacred. Elaborate preparations would transform the chosen chamber into a bridal suite of sorts, with fresh tatami mats laid beneath silk coverlets and incense burning to purify the air of any taint of commerce. The apprentice would be dressed in the finest kimono the house could afford, her face painted with extra care to create a vision of ethereal beauty that would justify the enormous sums being exchanged for her defloration. Yet beneath these beautiful trappings lay a cold calculation that reduced human dignity to market value, where purity became a resource to be harvested and sold to the highest bidder. The psychological preparation for this moment often proved more brutal than the physical act itself, as young women were taught to dissociate their minds from their bodies, to become passive vessels for the desires of men they had never met and would likely never see again. The Okiya mothers, having endured this same ritual in their own youth, would offer advice delivered in voices devoid of emotion, explaining the necessity of submission and the importance of maintaining the illusion of willing participation. These conversations, conducted in whispered tones behind closed doors, carried with them the accumulated trauma of generations. As each woman passed down to the next, the bitter wisdom of survival in a world that viewed their bodies as commodities to be traded and consumed. The aftermath of mizuage marked not celebration, but a quiet mourning for something precious that could never be recovered, though the loss was buried beneath layers of professional necessity and social expectation. The newly deflowered apprentice would return to her studies with a different understanding of her place in the world, having learned firsthand that her value lay not in her thoughts or dreams, but in her ability to please others while suppressing her own desires. The substantial payment received for her innocence would be applied to her ever-growing debt, ensuring that this ultimate sacrifice would bind her even more tightly to the house that had orchestrated her transformation. Meanwhile, the patron who had purchased this privilege would return to his regular life, perhaps never considering the lasting impact of his transaction on the young woman whose childhood had ended in his embrace. Within the elegant confines of the Okiya houses, where beauty and artistry masked a system of financial bondage more insidious than chains, young Geisha would discover that their debut into the flower world marked not freedom, but the beginning of a debt so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon of possibility. Every silk thread that adorned their bodies, every grain of rice that sustained their lives, every lesson that shaped their minds carried a price that would be meticulously recorded in ledgers kept by house mothers whose smiles concealed the calculating hearts of merchants. The initial sum paid for their purchase as children became merely the foundation upon which a mountain of obligations would be built, each beautiful kimono and precious ornament adding another stone to the burden they would carry throughout their lives. The Okasan, those formidable matriarchs who ruled their domains with iron wills wrapped in velvet gloves, possessed an almost supernatural ability to transform every necessity into profit and every luxury into chains. The cost of a single formal kimono could exceed what a common laborer might earn in several years, yet the geisha were expected to maintain wardrobes containing dozens of such garments, each appropriate for specific seasons and occasions. Food, lodging, cosmetics, hair ornaments, music lessons, dance instruction. Even the very air they breathed within the house walls carried charges that would accumulate like falling snow, beautiful and seemingly weightless until the accumulated burden became too heavy to bear. The accounting books recorded every expenditure with religious precision, creating financial labyrinths from which escape seemed impossible. As the years passed, and the geisha matured into skilled entertainers capable of commanding substantial fees for their performances, they would discover with growing horror that their earnings vanished into the ever-hungry maw of their accumulated debt, like water disappearing into desert sand. The house would claim the largest portion of their income as payment for room and board, while additional percentages disappeared to cover past expenses, interest on outstanding balances, and mysterious fees that seemed to multiply in the darkness. Even successful geisha who attracted wealthy patrons and commanded premium prices for their company would find their liberation perpetually postponed, as new expenses arose to replace old ones, and the goal of financial independence retreated like a mirage before their desperate pursuit. The cruelest aspect of this system lay in its ability to transform the geisha into willing participants in their own enslavement, as they learned to take pride in the very luxuries that bound them ever more tightly to their servitude. A new kimono became both a symbol of achievement and another link in the chain, while success in attracting wealthy clients only served to justify higher living standards that required even greater earnings to maintain. The house mothers, themselves products of this same system, would speak with genuine conviction about the necessity of these arrangements, having long since internalized the logic that equated beauty with debt and artistry with bondage. Thus, the cycle perpetuated itself across generations, creating a world where freedom became the ultimate luxury that few could ever afford to purchase, and where the pursuit of beauty trapped its practitioners in golden cages from which escape remained forever tantalizingly out of reach. Through the narrow streets of the pleasure quarters, where lantern light cast dancing shadows upon wooden facades and the sound of shamisen drifted from hidden chambers, there existed a social order more complex and unforgiving than the imperial court itself. Every gesture, every glance, every seemingly casual encounter carried weight in a world where one's position in the hierarchy could determine not merely comfort or discomfort, but survival itself. The newest apprentices learned quickly that a single misstep in protocol could result in social exile more devastating than physical punishment, while seasoned geisha moved through their daily interactions with the calculated precision of chess masters, each word chosen to maintain their precarious positions in an ever-shifting landscape of alliances and rivalries. At the apex of this ruthless pyramid sat the most senior geisha, those legendary figures whose names were whispered with equal measures of reverence and fear throughout the districts. These women, having survived decades in a profession that destroyed most before their prime, wielded power that extended far beyond their own houses, their favor capable of elevating promising newcomers to heights of success or condemning them to years of obscurity and struggle. They moved through the quarter like queens dispensing judgment, their elaborate kimono and perfect bearing announcing their status to all who encountered them, while younger women bowed deeply in their presence, knowing that even the smallest slight could echo through their careers for years to come. Beneath them, the established geisha formed shifting alliances based on mutual benefit and shared patrons, their relationships a delicate dance of cooperation and competition. The apprentices occupied the lowest rungs of this merciless ladder, their lives governed by rules so numerous and subtle that mastery seemed impossible, yet failure to observe them carried consequences that could destroy their future prospects before they had truly begun. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated their place in each interaction, the precise depth of bow required for different ranks, the proper distance to maintain when walking behind their seniors, the exact phrases that conveyed respect without appearing servile or confidence without seeming presumptuous. A maiko who dared to wear colors inappropriate to her station might find herself the target of whispered criticism that would spread through the district like wildfire, while one who failed to acknowledge a senior geisha with proper deference could face months of cold treatment that would isolate her from the very connections she needed to advance. Perhaps most insidious of all was the way this hierarchy fostered a culture of constant surveillance and judgment, where every action was evaluated not only for its immediate appropriateness, but for its potential to shift the delicate balance of power within the community. Geisha learned to smile while calculating the implications of their rivals' successes, to offer congratulations while privately hoping for their competitors' failures, to form friendships while remaining ever vigilant against betrayal. The house mothers encouraged this competitive atmosphere, understanding that mutual mistrust among their charges prevented the formation of alliances that might challenge their authority, while the most successful geisha learned to navigate these treacherous waters by becoming masters of manipulation themselves. Thus, the system perpetuated itself through generations, creating a world where beauty and grace served as masks for the brutal realities of social Darwinism played out in silk and powder. In the dim morning light of preparation chambers, where mirrors reflected ghostly figures emerging from the shadows of sleep, the daily ritual of transformation began with an application of substances that would slowly poison the very women they were meant to beautify. The white foundation that created the porcelain perfection, so prized in the flower world, contained lead in concentrations that would horrify modern physicians. Yet this deadly makeup was applied with religious devotion each day, layer upon layer building up a mask of toxic beauty that seeped through the skin and accumulated in the bloodstream. The rice powder mixed with these heavy metals created a luminous pallor that seemed to glow with otherworldly radiance. But beneath this ethereal surface, the body waged a losing battle against substances that would gradually corrupt the nervous system and attack vital organs with each application. The pursuit of the perfect silhouette demanded sacrifices that extended far beyond the realm of mere discomfort, as the obi sashes that defined the geisha's iconic appearance were wound with such crushing tightness that breathing became a conscious effort rather than a natural function. These elaborate silk bindings, often weighing 20 pounds or more when fully dressed, compressed the torso with such force that internal organs shifted position, circulation slowed to dangerous levels, and the simple act of sitting required careful calculation to avoid fainting from oxygen deprivation. The apprentices learned to endure this constriction as a test of their dedication, their faces maintaining serene composure even as their bodies screamed for relief, while house mothers adjusted the bindings ever tighter, believing that true beauty required the complete subjugation of physical comfort to aesthetic perfection. The traditional hairstyles that crowned these living works of art demanded their own terrible price, as heavy ornaments and elaborate constructions pulled at scalps already tender from the harsh chemicals used to achieve the required texture and shine. The weight of these architectural marvels, adorned with metal combs, jade pins, and hanging ornaments that caught the light with every movement, created constant pressure that led to chronic headaches and eventual hair loss in many practitioners. Sleep became a carefully choreographed affair, as the elaborate coiffures could not be disturbed, forcing the women to rest their necks on special wooden blocks that maintained the hairstyle while ensuring a night of fitful, uncomfortable slumber. The hair itself, subjected to regular applications of camellia oil and rice water, would often break and thin from the constant manipulation required to maintain these impossible standards. As years accumulated and the cumulative effects of these beauty rituals took their inevitable toll, many geisha would develop tremors from lead poisoning, chronic back problems from the weight and constriction of their garments, and respiratory issues from the restriction of their breathing apparatus. The most successful among them learned to hide these physical deteriorations behind their trained masks of perfection, applying ever heavier layers of makeup to conceal the pallor of illness and using their hard-won skills in movement to compensate for bodies that had been systematically damaged in pursuit of an ideal that valued appearance over health. The irony remained that in their quest to embody eternal feminine beauty, These women sacrificed the very vitality that should have been beauty's foundation, creating stunning facades that concealed the gradual destruction of the bodies that housed them. When the heavy wooden doors of the Okaya closed behind the newly arrived children, they sealed not only bodies within, but severed connections that had formed the very foundation of their young souls, creating wounds that would never fully heal despite the passage of decades. The house mothers understood with calculating precision that true transformation required the complete eradication of former identities, and so the first cruel lesson involved the systematic destruction of every link to the world these children had known. Letters from desperate parents were intercepted and destroyed before they could reach their intended recipients, while any mention of home or family was met with swift punishment that taught the girls to bury their memories deeper than forgotten graves. The philosophy was simple yet devastating. To create perfect geisha, they must first create perfect orphans. The children learned to suppress their natural longing for familiar voices and comforting embraces, as any display of homesickness was treated as weakness that threatened their professional development. They were forbidden from speaking their birth names, even in whispered conversations with other apprentices, and encouraged to view their former lives as dreams from which they had awakened into a more refined reality. The Okasan would speak with practiced conviction about the honor of their new existence, explaining how their sacrifice elevated them above the common peasant families who had willingly sold them. Yet these words could not fill the hollow spaces where maternal love had once resided. Gradually, the sharp edges of memory would soften and blur, as the demands of daily training left little time for dwelling on what had been lost. As seasons turned and years accumulated like fallen leaves, the apprentices would discover that their capacity for forming deep emotional connections had been systematically diminished through this early trauma of abandonment. The other girls in the house became competitors rather than sisters, their relationships governed by the harsh realities of professional advancement rather than genuine affection, while the house mothers remained distant figures of authority whose approval could never replace the unconditional love they had once known. Even when visits home were occasionally permitted after years of service, these reunions often proved more painful than healing, as the young women found themselves strangers in their birth families, their refined speech and elegant mannerisms creating barriers that made genuine communication impossible. The most tragic consequence of this enforced isolation revealed itself in the inability of many geisha to form lasting bonds even in their adult years, as the early severing of natural family connections had damaged something essential in their emotional architecture. They learned to perform intimacy with the same skill they brought to dance and music, creating convincing illusions of warmth and affection that satisfied their clients while leaving their own hearts untouched by genuine feeling. The few who attempted to maintain secret correspondence with family members often found that time and distance had transformed their loved ones into virtual strangers, while those who tried to return home after earning their freedom discovered that the innocent children who had left no longer existed, replaced by sophisticated women who could never again find comfort in the simple peasant life they had once known. Within the perfumed chambers and silk-draped alcoves of the pleasure quarters, where beauty masked the most ruthless of competitions, geisha learned that survival depended not merely on artistic skill, but on their ability to outmaneuver rivals who smiled while plotting their downfall. The pursuit of wealthy patrons transformed these women into gladiators wrapped in kimono, their weapons consisting of whispered rumors, strategic alliances, and carefully orchestrated displays of superiority that could destroy a competitor's reputation with the subtlety of falling cherry petals. Each new client represented a prize to be won through whatever means necessary, while the loss of an established patron to a younger or more skilled rival could spell financial ruin that would echo through years of struggle and diminished prospects. The house mothers actively encouraged this atmosphere of competition, understanding that mutual distrust among their charges prevented the formation of alliances that might challenge their authority, while simultaneously driving each geisha to perfect her skills in pursuit of advantage over her sisters. They would assign the most promising apprentices to the same tea houses and parties, watching with calculating eyes as the young women learned to smile graciously while internally seething at each other's successes, their congratulations as hollow as temple bells ringing in empty courtyards. The older geisha, having survived decades of such warfare, became masters of psychological manipulation, capable of destroying a rival's confidence with a perfectly timed compliment that highlighted a perceived flaw, or elevating their own status by spreading carefully crafted stories that cast competitors in unflattering light. The most insidious aspect of this competitive environment lay in its ability to corrupt genuine friendships before they could form, as every kindness became suspect and every confidence shared carried the risk of being weaponized by the recipient. Geisha learned to guard their secrets as jealously as their most precious kimono, knowing that a moment of vulnerability could provide ammunition for rivals seeking to expose weaknesses to potential patrons. The sharing of artistic techniques, which should have elevated the entire community, became fraught with deception as established performers would deliberately provide incorrect instruction to apprentices they viewed as threats, while the most talented among them learned to practice their most impressive skills in private, revealing their full capabilities only when the element of surprise could guarantee maximum impact. Perhaps most tragically, this system of perpetual competition prevented the formation of the supportive networks that might have provided emotional sustenance in a profession that demanded the constant suppression of authentic feeling. Instead of finding solace in shared experiences of hardship and exploitation, geisha were conditioned to view each other as obstacles to overcome rather than companions in struggle. Their isolation made complete by the knowledge that even their closest associates would sacrifice their friendship for the promise of professional advancement. The tea houses and party venues became battlegrounds, where every performance was measured not only against artistic standards, but against the capabilities of rivals, while the clients, often unaware of the complex dramas playing out before them, enjoyed entertainment that was sharpened to razor keenness by the desperate need of each performer to prove her superiority over all others. In the shadowed corners of the flower world, where tradition and commerce intertwined like lovers in an eternal embrace, the Dana system emerged as perhaps the most complex and morally ambiguous aspect of geisha life, creating relationships that defied easy categorization while serving the financial interests of all parties except the women at their center. These arrangements, cloaked in the language of patronage and artistic appreciation, bound successful geisha to wealthy men through contracts that granted exclusive access to their company in exchange for substantial financial support that could liberate them from the crushing debts of their houses. Yet beneath the elegant facade of cultural sponsorship lay relationships that bore uncomfortable resemblances to legalized concubinage, where the line between artistic patronage and sexual commerce blurred beyond recognition in chambers perfumed with incense and decorated with silk. The negotiation of these arrangements took place in hushed conversations between house mothers and prospective patrons, with the geisha herself often having little voice in the selection of the man who would essentially purchase her exclusive companionship for months or years at a time. The dana, typically wealthy merchants or nobles seeking the social prestige that came with sponsoring a renowned entertainer, would provide not only the funds necessary to maintain their chosen geisha in appropriate style, but also the political and social protection that could advance her career within the rigid hierarchy of the pleasure districts. These men expected in return not merely artistic entertainment, but intimate companionship that included sharing meals, attending cultural events together, and most significantly, sexual access that was understood but rarely explicitly stated in the formal agreements that governed these relationships. The geisha trapped within these gilded cages learned to navigate the complex emotional terrain of relationships that demanded the performance of genuine affection while maintaining the professional distance necessary for psychological survival. They became actresses of the highest caliber, capable of convincing their patrons of their sincere devotion while internally maintaining the detachment required to endure intimate encounters with men they had not chosen and often found personally repugnant. The most successful among them learned to compartmentalize their emotions so effectively that they could perform passion with the same technical precision they brought to their shamisen playing, creating illusions of love so convincing that their patrons often believed themselves genuinely cherished by women who were essentially sophisticated prisoners of economic necessity. The psychological toll of these arrangements revealed itself in the hollow eyes that sometimes flickered behind painted masks, as women who had been taught to value their artistic integrity above all else found themselves reduced to expensive courtesans whose primary function was to satisfy the ego and desires of men who viewed them as beautiful possessions rather than human beings. The Dana system created a peculiar form of slavery wrapped in silk and justified by cultural tradition, where women could achieve financial security and social status only by surrendering their bodily autonomy to purchasers who confused ownership with appreciation. Thus, the most accomplished artists of their generation found themselves trapped in relationships that corrupted the very artistry that had made them valuable, their talents becoming mere decorations to enhance arrangements that served everyone's interests except their own. Through the paper-thin walls of the Okiya houses, where every whispered conversation and muffled sob could be heard by ears trained to detect the slightest deviation from prescribed behavior, the house mothers maintained a surveillance network more comprehensive than any prison warden could devise. These formidable women, having survived their own years of subjugation to emerge as controllers rather than controlled, understood that total dominion required constant vigilance, and so they positioned themselves as omnipresent forces whose awareness penetrated every corner of their charge's existence. From the moment the apprentices opened their eyes in the pre-dawn darkness until they finally surrendered to exhausted sleep on their narrow futons, every action was observed, evaluated, and catalogued by women whose own freedom had been purchased through the systematic oppression of those who came after them. The Okasan possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever forbidden activities might be taking place, their soft-souled tabi allowing them to move through the wooden corridors with ghost-like silence as they monitored conversations, inspected personal belongings, and scrutinized every aspect of their charge's daily routines for signs of rebellion or inappropriate attachment. No letter could be written without permission. No friendship could develop without approval. No private moment could exist without the possibility of intrusion by these guardians, whose declared mission of protection served primarily to maintain the economic investments they represented. The geisha learned to modulate their voices even in what seemed like private conversations, knowing that walls had ears and that any expression of discontent or longing for freedom would be swiftly reported and severely punished. Perhaps most insidious was the way this constant observation corrupted the relationships between the women themselves, as the house mothers skillfully recruited informants from among the apprentices and junior geisha, offering small privileges and protection from punishment in exchange for reports on their sisters' activities and state of mind. The atmosphere of mutual suspicion that resulted made genuine friendship nearly impossible, as each woman learned to guard her thoughts and feelings as carefully as she protected her most valuable possessions, never knowing which confidant might betray her secrets to curry favor with the authorities. Even the most innocent conversations carried the risk of misinterpretation by listeners whose survival depended on maintaining the favor of women who held absolute power over their daily existence. The control extended far beyond mere physical surveillance to encompass every aspect of personal choice and individual expression, as the house mothers dictated not only what their charges could wear and eat, but how they should think and feel about every aspect of their existence. Emotional responses were monitored as closely as physical behavior, with excessive displays of sadness, anger, or even joy being interpreted as signs of dangerous independence that required immediate correction through isolation, reduced privileges, or increased training burdens. The most successful Okasan understood that true control required not merely compliance, but the complete internalization of their values and expectations, transforming their charges into willing participants in their own oppression, who would eventually perpetuate the system by becoming house mothers themselves. Thus, the cycle of surveillance and control perpetuated itself across generations, creating women who could no longer distinguish between protection and imprisonment, guidance and manipulation, love and the systematic destruction of everything that made them human. Beneath the luminous perfection of painted faces and graceful movements, the bodies of geisha bore the accumulated damage of years spent in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal that demanded the systematic sacrifice of physical health to visual beauty. The daily application of lead-based cosmetics, while creating the porcelain complexion so prized in the flower world, slowly poisoned the blood and nervous system, leading to tremors that would begin as barely perceptible quivers and progress to debilitating shakes that no amount of training could disguise. The white foundation that transformed mortal flesh into otherworldly perfection contained mercury and other heavy metals that penetrated the skin with each application, accumulating in vital organs until the very substances that created their ethereal beauty began to attack the liver, kidneys, and brain with relentless persistence that would eventually manifest in symptoms ranging from chronic fatigue to devastating neurological disorders. The dietary restrictions imposed upon these living works of art in pursuit of the slender silhouette deemed essential for their profession created a different but equally insidious form of physical destruction, as chronic malnutrition weakened bones and compromised immune systems while the women maintained their practice schedules with religious devotion. Rice became both sustenance and luxury, doled out in carefully measured portions that often fell far short of what their bodies required to sustain the demanding physical regimen of dance training and performances, while protein remained a rare indulgence reserved for special occasions or rewards for exceptional behavior. The resulting vitamin deficiencies manifested in brittle hair that broke despite careful tending, skin that bruised at the slightest touch despite layers of protective powder, and a susceptibility to illness that transformed minor ailments into prolonged periods of weakness that further compromised their ability to earn the income necessary for survival. The crushing weight of elaborate kimono and the bone-tight bindings of obi sashes created their own catalog of medical horrors, as compressed organs struggled to function normally while circulation was restricted to the point where fainting became a common occurrence that had to be concealed from clients at all costs. The heavy ornaments that adorned their elaborate hairstyles caused chronic tension, headaches, and eventual hair loss, while the wooden pillows required to preserve their coiffures ensured that restorative sleep remained forever beyond reach, creating cycles of exhaustion that compounded every other health problem they faced. Respiratory issues became endemic among women whose breathing was systematically restricted by garments that prioritized appearance over the basic biological need for oxygen, leading to a pallor that was attributed to refined beauty, but actually indicated chronic oxygen deprivation. As the years accumulated and these various forms of damage compounded, many geisha developed the characteristic tremor and pallor of lead poisoning, chronic digestive problems from years of inadequate nutrition, and spinal deformities from the weight and constriction of their daily costume. Yet the medical establishment of the time viewed these symptoms as inevitable consequences of their chosen profession rather than preventable results of systemic abuse. The most tragic irony lay in the fact that the very treatments available to wealthy clients remained beyond the reach of the women who entertained them, as their earnings were consumed by debts and house expenses that left no room for medical care beyond the most basic remedies. Thus, these paragons of feminine beauty slowly deteriorated beneath their painted masks, their bodies telling the true story of their profession, while their faces maintained the serene composure that had been purchased with their health. In the lamplit chambers where silk screens filtered golden light, and the air hung heavy with incense and unspoken expectations, geisha performed their most demanding art, the complete transformation of their inner selves into whatever their clients required, regardless of their own emotional state or personal inclinations. Night after night, they would enter tea houses carrying the weight of their own sorrows, fears, and unfulfilled longings, only to emerge as radiant beings whose every gesture conveyed joy, whose every word sparkled with wit, and whose every glance promised understanding and acceptance to men who often viewed them as elaborate toys designed for their amusement. The skill required to maintain this emotional charade while wrestling with their own humanity demanded a level of psychological compartmentalization that would have impressed the most disciplined actors. Yet these performances carried no curtain call, no moment of release when the mask could be lowered and authentic feeling allowed to surface. The clients who sought their company brought with them an endless parade of human weakness and need that the geisha were expected to absorb and transform into wisdom, comfort, and pleasure, regardless of how those burdens might affect their own psychological well-being. Merchant princes would arrive seeking validation for business decisions that had ruined families, while minor nobles would demand sympathy for romantic disappointments that paled beside the profound emotional deprivation these women experienced daily. The geisha learned to listen with apparent fascination to stories they had heard countless times before, to laugh at jokes that had long since lost any hint of humor, and to offer counsel on matters they were forbidden from experiencing themselves, all while maintaining the illusion that each client was unique and worthy of their complete attention and genuine care. Perhaps most cruel was the requirement that they manufacture romantic interest and sexual desire for men they often found personally repugnant, transforming their bodies into instruments of pleasure while their minds retreated to protected spaces where their true selves could remain untouched by the transactions taking place. They became master actresses of passion, capable of convincing the most skeptical observer of their genuine arousal and affection, while internally maintaining the emotional distance necessary for psychological survival. The clients, seeking not merely physical gratification, but the ego satisfaction of believing themselves truly desired, demanded performances that went far beyond mere technical skill to encompass the very essence of feminine responsiveness, requiring the geisha to access and manipulate their own authentic emotional responses in service of elaborate deceptions. The cumulative effect of years spent suppressing their own desires while catering to those of others created a peculiar form of emotional atrophy, as many geisha found themselves unable to access their genuine feelings even in moments of privacy, their authentic selves having been buried so deeply beneath layers of performance that they became strangers to their own hearts. The most successful among them learned to find satisfaction in the perfection of their craft, rather than in genuine human connection, transforming themselves into living artworks whose beauty lay partly in their complete removal from the messy realities of authentic emotion. Thus, these women, trained to be the ultimate companions, became the loneliest souls in a world that celebrated their ability to provide comfort they themselves would never receive. When cherry blossoms painted the ancient streets in delicate pink, and the air carried the promise of spring's renewal, the pleasure quarters would transform into stages for elaborate festivals that demanded from their performers a level of endurance that would have challenged the most dedicated soldiers. The seasonal celebrations, while bringing increased income to the houses and opportunities for advancement to the most skilled entertainers, extracted their price in human exhaustion, as geisha were expected to maintain their grace and artistry through marathon sessions of performance that stretched from sunset to dawn for days on end. The hanami parties beneath blooming sakura trees required them to kneel for hours on hard ground while maintaining perfect posture and unwavering smiles, their elaborate kimono providing no protection against the chill of spring evenings as they poured sake with steady hands despite the numbness creeping through their limbs. The summer festivals brought their own particular torments, as heavy silk garments and multiple layers of underclothing transformed the humid heat into a suffocating embrace that tested the limits of human endurance, while the geisha were forbidden from showing any sign of discomfort, lest they diminish the ethereal illusion their clients had paid handsomely to enjoy. The autumn moon viewing ceremonies demanded performances that continued through the night, as guests competed to demonstrate their cultural sophistication by extending the revelries until sunrise, while the geisha struggled to maintain their composure despite fatigue that made their painted faces feel like masks of lead weighing upon their aching skulls. During these extended engagements, they learned to sleep while kneeling, to eat without disturbing their makeup, and to answer nature's call without assistance while bound in garments that required the help of multiple attendants to properly arrange. The house mothers viewed these seasonal peaks as opportunities to maximize their investments, scheduling their most valuable performers for multiple overlapping engagements that required them to dash between venues with barely enough time to adjust their appearance and compose their minds for the next performance. The apprentices, desperate to prove their worth and advance their standing, would accept assignments that pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits, performing on injured feet and strained muscles while maintaining the serene composure that had become their professional signature. The competition for prestigious festival bookings created additional pressure as geisha vied to demonstrate their dedication through increasingly extreme displays of endurance, leading some to collapse from exhaustion or illness that they had concealed until their bodies could no longer sustain the deception. Perhaps most tragic was the way these celebrations of seasonal beauty and cultural refinement became associated in the minds of the performers with suffering and exploitation rather than joy and artistic fulfillment, as the very festivals that should have provided opportunities for creative expression instead became endurance tests that measured their value as commodities rather than their worth as human beings. The cherry blossoms that symbolized the fleeting nature of beauty became reminders of their own ephemeral value in a system that would discard them as soon as age or illness diminished their appeal. While the moon that inspired poets for centuries looked down upon women who had been taught to suppress their own appreciation of beauty in favor of manufacturing it for the pleasure of others. Thus, the rhythms of nature that had once marked times of celebration and renewal were transformed into cycles of exploitation that left these artists too exhausted to appreciate the very beauty they were employed to embody. Within the shadowed halls of the Okiya houses, where tradition flowed like poison through the veins of generations, a cruel paradox emerged as those who had suffered the most systematic abuse became the architects of its continuation, their own survival having depended upon the complete internalization of the very system that had broken them. The senior geisha, having endured years of humiliation, deprivation, and exploitation, found themselves transformed not into advocates for change, but into guardians of the status quo, their hard-won positions of authority dependent upon their willingness to inflict upon newcomers the same torments that had once nearly destroyed their own spirits. They spoke with genuine conviction about the necessity of harsh treatment, having learned to interpret their own suffering as essential preparation for a profession that demanded absolute submission to the will of others. Their voices carrying the authority of experience as they explained why compassion would only weaken those destined to face the unforgiving realities of the flower world. The house mothers, those formidable women who ruled their domains with iron wills wrapped in silk sleeves, had themselves been shaped by the same brutal apprenticeship system that they now administered with religious devotion. Their own memories of childhood trauma transformed through psychological alchemy into wisdom about the necessities of artistic training. They could recall with perfect clarity the terror and despair of their own early years. Yet these recollections served not to inspire mercy, but to reinforce their belief that suffering was the only path to the perfection demanded by their profession. The bamboo switches that had once fallen upon their own backs now rested in their hands. The harsh words that had once shattered their childish dreams now flowed from their lips with practiced authority, as they convinced themselves that cruelty administered in service of artistic excellence was fundamentally different from mere sadism. The apprentices who survived this systematic brutalization often emerged with their capacity for empathy so thoroughly compromised that they could observe the suffering of newer arrivals with the same detached professionalism they brought to their artistic performances, having learned that emotional involvement with the pain of others was a luxury they could not afford in a world where survival depended upon maintaining the favor of those in power. The few who retained their natural compassion learned to hide it carefully, understanding that any attempt to protect or comfort the younger girls would be interpreted as weakness that could jeopardize their own precarious positions within the hierarchy. Thus, the system perpetuated itself through the creation of survivors who confused their own damage with strength, their trauma with wisdom, and their compliance with virtue. Perhaps most insidious was the way this cycle of abuse was sanctified by cultural tradition and artistic necessity, creating a framework that transformed victimization into virtue and suffering into a sacred rite of passage that connected each generation to those who had come before. The Okasan could point to their own achievements as evidence that harsh treatment produced superior artists, while conveniently ignoring the countless young women who had been destroyed by the same methods, their broken spirits and damaged bodies serving as invisible foundations upon which the success stories were built. The entire system rested upon the fundamental lie that cruelty was essential for the creation of beauty, when in truth it merely ensured the continuation of a profitable enterprise that consumed young lives as fuel for the entertainment of those wealthy enough to purchase the illusion of refined femininity. When the drums of war echoed across the islands and the social order that had sustained the pleasure quarters for centuries began to crumble like ancient parchment touched by flame, the geisha discovered that their elaborate world of beauty and refinement was as fragile as the paper screens that divided their chambers. The wealthy merchants and nobles who had once competed for their favors suddenly found their fortunes redirected toward military necessities, their disposable income vanishing into the endless appetite of war machines that had no use for shamisen music or elegant poetry. The tea houses that had once glowed with lantern light and rang with the laughter of prosperous patrons now stood empty and dark, their wooden floors echoing with the footsteps of creditors rather than the whispered slippers of entertainers, while the geisha waited in vain for summons that would never come. The house mothers who had built their financial empires upon the assumption that men would always seek beauty and pleasure regardless of external circumstances, watched in horror as their carefully calculated investments dissolved like sugar in rain. Their debtor servants suddenly transformed from valuable assets into costly burdens that consumed resources without generating income. The elaborate kimono that had once commanded fortunes became worthless relics of a vanished world, their silk threads no more valuable than the paper money that inflation had rendered meaningless, while the artistic skills that had taken decades to perfect proved useless in a society that now valued only practical contributions to the war effort. Many houses were forced to sell their most precious possessions at ruinous prices, their ancient treasures scattered to bargain hunters who cared nothing for the cultural significance of objects that had once been priceless. The geisha themselves, having been trained for no occupation other than the entertainment of wealthy men, found themselves as helpless as exotic birds released into a winter storm, their refined skills offering no protection against the harsh realities of economic collapse and social transformation. Those who had managed to accumulate small savings watched their nest eggs evaporate as currency lost its value and banks failed, while the younger women discovered that their debts to the houses remained as binding as ever, despite the complete disappearance of opportunities to earn income through their traditional profession. Some attempted to find work in factories or other wartime industries, but their soft hands and delicate constitutions, cultivated through years of pampered existence, proved woefully inadequate for the demands of manual labor that the new economy required. The most tragic aspect of their plight lay in the complete absence of any social safety net for women whose entire identity had been constructed around their role as entertainers in a world that no longer had use for entertainment. Their specialized knowledge and refined sensibilities becoming not merely irrelevant, but actively detrimental to survival in a society that now demanded only utility and strength. Many were forced to accept work that destroyed everything they had once held sacred about their profession, while others simply disappeared into the chaos of social upheaval, their fates unknown and largely unmourned by a society too preoccupied with survival to concern itself with the destruction of an entire class of women whose existence had depended upon the maintenance of an economic and social order that had proven as ephemeral as the cherry blossoms they had once celebrated. In the perfumed chambers where dreams went to die, geisha learned that the price of their artistic perfection included the surrender of the most fundamental experiences that defined womanhood, their bodies transformed into vessels for others' pleasure, while being denied the natural fulfillment of creating and nurturing life of their own. The contracts that bound them to their houses contained clauses more binding than iron chains, explicitly forbidding marriage and motherhood as incompatible with the dedication required for their profession. The house mothers explaining with cold logic that divided loyalties would diminish their value as entertainers, while the responsibilities of family would interfere with their availability to clients. Those who dared to speak of longing for children were reminded that their duty lay in serving as eternal maidens, forever poised on the threshold of womanhood, but never permitted to cross into the realm of wives and mothers that represented the natural progression of female existence. The biological urges that nature had woven into their very essence became sources of torment rather than joy, as monthly cycles served only as reminders of reproductive possibilities that would never be fulfilled, while the sight of children playing in temple courtyards triggered waves of grief for the families they would never create. The house mothers, themselves victims of the same cruel prohibition, had learned to speak of motherhood as a burden that would destroy the purity of artistic expression, their voices carrying the hollow conviction of women who had convinced themselves that sacrifice was virtue rather than acknowledging the profound loss that had shaped their existence. The few who became pregnant through accident or desperate hope faced forced termination of their conditions. The procedures conducted in back rooms by practitioners whose skills were questionable but whose discretion was absolute, leaving the women to recover from both physical trauma and emotional devastation while maintaining their performance schedules without revealing their suffering. The prohibition extended beyond mere childbearing to encompass the entire spectrum of domestic happiness that other women took for granted, as romantic love was transformed from natural human experience into professional performance, leaving these artists of intimacy forever strangers to authentic emotional connection. They watched from behind painted masks as their clients spoke of wives and children with genuine affection, forced to smile and nod while their own hearts withered from the absence of such bonds, their trained responses concealing the bitter irony that those who performed love most skillfully were denied its authentic experience. The successful geisha learned to channel their maternal instincts into caring for younger apprentices, creating surrogate family relationships that provided pale echoes of the fulfillment they had been denied, while secretly knowing that even these connections would be severed when competitive pressures or house politics demanded it. As years accumulated and their reproductive years slipped away like sand through an hourglass, many geisha faced the devastating realization that their sacrifice had purchased nothing more valuable than the temporary admiration of men who would forget them as soon as younger faces appeared to capture their attention. The elderly geisha, who had survived decades in the profession, often became living warnings of the ultimate cost of their choices. Their childless old age, a preview of the isolation awaiting all who had traded the possibility of family for the illusion of artistic immortality. Thus, the flower world created women who could embody every aspect of feminine beauty and grace except the fundamental creativity that defined womanhood itself, their perfection purchased through the systematic denial of life's most essential experiences. In the mirror-lined chambers where time moved with the inexorable cruelty of winter claiming autumn leaves, geisha confronted the most devastating enemy their profession could offer: the natural progression of years that transformed their greatest asset into their ultimate liability. Each morning brought fresh evidence of time's relentless advance, as fine lines appeared around eyes that had once sparkled with youthful promise, while hands that had moved with liquid grace began to show the telltale spots and veins of advancing age, despite all efforts to conceal them beneath layers of powder and paint. The very faces that had once commanded fortunes for their ethereal beauty gradually revealed the human mortality beneath the artistic perfection, requiring ever more elaborate cosmetic interventions to maintain the illusion of eternal youth that clients expected and competitors eagerly waited to supplant with their own unmarked features. The physical demands of their profession, which had once seemed as natural as breathing, became increasingly difficult to maintain as bodies that had been pushed beyond reasonable limits for decades began to rebel against continued abuse, joints stiffening from years of kneeling in formal positions while muscles weakened from chronic malnutrition disguised as aesthetic discipline. The elaborate kimono that had once seemed weightless now felt like lead cloaks dragging at shoulders that ached constantly, while the intricate dances that had once flowed like water from their limbs required conscious effort to execute with anything approaching their former grace. The shamisen strings that had once responded to their touch like extensions of their souls now required greater pressure from fingers that trembled with the early signs of the neurological damage caused by years of lead-based cosmetics, their music losing the effortless perfection that had once set them apart from their competitors. Perhaps most cruel was the gradual shift in client preferences that occurred with merciless predictability, as patrons who had once competed for their attention began to seek younger entertainers whose novelty had not yet been diminished by familiarity, their loyalty proving as ephemeral as cherry blossoms, despite years of carefully cultivated relationships. The aging geisha watched with growing desperation as appointments that had once been guaranteed began to disappear, their established patrons making polite excuses while their eyes wandered to the fresh faces of newly debuted apprentices whose very inexperience became an asset in a market that prized discovery over refinement. The house mothers, ever calculating in their business decisions, began to reduce the resources devoted to maintaining their aging assets, assigning them less prestigious engagements while redirecting their attention and investment toward younger women who represented the future of their enterprises. The final tragedy lay in the recognition that all their years of sacrifice and suffering had purchased nothing more permanent than temporary beauty in a profession that discarded its practitioners as soon as time revealed their humanity beneath the painted perfection. The skills they had spent decades perfecting became increasingly irrelevant as clients sought not artistic excellence, but the excitement of youth and novelty, their mastery of classical arts unable to compete with the simple appeal of unmarked skin and untested charms. Those who survived into their later years often found themselves relegated to teaching roles that paid a fraction of their former earnings, their vast knowledge and experience valued primarily as tools for training the next generation of women who would eventually face the same inevitable decline. Within the incense-perfumed practice rooms where tradition lived and breathed like an ancient spirit demanding constant veneration, the traditional arts became both the golden key to survival and the silken chains that bound geisha to a life of endless pursuit of an impossible ideal. The shamisen, with its 3 strings that could produce sounds ranging from heartbreaking melancholy to crystalline joy, required not merely technical proficiency, but a level of emotional transparency that left its practitioners spiritually naked before their audiences, every note revealing the depth of feeling they were simultaneously required to experience and suppress. The classical dances that had been refined over centuries demanded that each movement flow from a reservoir of perfect grace that must never be depleted, regardless of physical pain, emotional turmoil, or the crushing weight of personal despair that might be consuming the performer from within. The pursuit of perfection in these ancient disciplines offered the only path to financial security and social status available to women trapped within the pleasure quarters. Yet it simultaneously demanded the sacrifice of everything that made them human individuals rather than living embodiments of cultural ideals. Every gesture must be calculated to achieve maximum aesthetic impact. Every expression must convey precisely the emotion required by the artistic moment. Every breath must serve the greater purpose of creating beauty that transcended the merely personal to achieve the realm of the eternal. The students learned that spontaneity was the enemy of perfection, that authentic emotion must be channeled through forms so rigid and demanding that years of training were required before they could appear natural, while any deviation from classical standards was treated as a form of artistic sacrilege that could destroy a reputation built through decades of disciplined effort. The irony lay in the fact that mastery of these arts, which should have provided creative fulfillment and personal expression, instead became another form of imprisonment, as the geisha discovered that success required the complete subordination of their individual artistic vision to the expectations of traditionalist patrons who viewed innovation as corruption. The most accomplished practitioners learned to perform with such technical perfection that their art appeared effortless. Yet this very achievement required the suppression of personal style and creative impulse in favor of reproducing classical forms with mechanical precision that left no room for the spontaneous inspiration that should have been art's greatest joy. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry composition, and musical performance that comprised their curriculum became elaborate forms of meditation that demanded the practitioner's complete presence while simultaneously requiring the absence of personal desire or individual expression. Perhaps most tragically, these women who achieved true mastery of Japan's most refined cultural expressions often found that their expertise had transformed them into living museums rather than artists, their value lying not in their capacity for creative growth, but in their ability to preserve and reproduce forms that had been perfected by previous generations and must never be altered or improved. The very traditions that had offered escape from the brutal realities of their circumstances became new forms of captivity that demanded even greater sacrifices than physical servitude. As the pursuit of artistic perfection required the systematic elimination of everything that distinguished them as individuals in favor of becoming flawless vessels for cultural transmission. Thus, the arts that should have been their salvation became the most elegant and demanding of prisons, offering the illusion of transcendence while binding them ever more tightly to a system that valued their capacity to embody tradition over their worth as human beings. In the shadow-dappled chambers of the tea houses, where silk screens filtered golden lamplight, and the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of incense and human desire, geisha encountered the full spectrum of masculine nature, from those rare souls who genuinely appreciated their artistry to predators who viewed their refined beauty as merely expensive wrapping around objects to be consumed. The most fortunate among them found patrons who understood the delicate balance between appreciation and possession. Men of genuine culture who sought intellectual companionship and artistic excellence rather than mere physical gratification, their conversations flowing like carefully composed poetry as they discussed literature, philosophy, and the subtle aesthetics of seasonal change. These exceptional clients became true connoisseurs of the geisha arts, their patronage offering not only financial security, but the profound satisfaction of being valued for their minds and talents, rather than simply their ability to please masculine vanity through submission and availability. Yet for every gentleman who approached them with respect and genuine appreciation, there lurked others whose wealth had purchased them the privilege of treating these accomplished women as elaborate courtesans, whose primary function was to fulfill fantasies that often bore no resemblance to the refined entertainment they had spent years learning to provide. These clients arrived with expectations shaped by crude imaginings rather than cultural understanding, their hands wandering without invitation while they demanded performances that had more in common with prostitution than artistic expression, their voices growing harsh when the geisha attempted to maintain the professional boundaries that separated their craft from mere sexual service. The house mothers, ever mindful of financial considerations, often pressured their charges to accommodate such behavior rather than risk losing valuable clients, creating situations where artistic integrity was sacrificed to economic necessity with devastating consequences for the women's psychological well-being. The most insidious relationships developed with clients who initially presented themselves as respectful patrons, only to gradually reveal more exploitative intentions as they gained the geisha's trust and dependency. Their generosity serving as a form of psychological manipulation that created debts of gratitude which could later be called in through increasingly inappropriate demands. These men understood that the geisha's precarious financial position made resistance difficult, their carefully calculated gifts and favors creating webs of obligation that trapped the women in relationships that slowly evolved from professional engagement to personal exploitation. The victims of such manipulation often found themselves isolated from other potential patrons as possessive clients used their financial influence to monopolize their time and attention, creating situations that resembled psychological captivity more than artistic patronage while maintaining the outward appearance of consensual arrangement. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the way this constant exposure to masculine exploitation gradually eroded the geisha's ability to recognize genuine respect and affection when it did appear, their survival instincts having been so thoroughly conditioned to expect abuse that acts of simple human decency were met with suspicion and confusion rather than gratitude. The few relationships that began with authentic mutual appreciation often deteriorated as the women's defensive mechanisms sabotaged connections that might have offered emotional salvation, their capacity for trust having been systematically destroyed by years of encounters with men who viewed their refined beauty as an invitation to possession rather than a work of art, to be appreciated from a respectful distance. Thus, the very profession that should have brought them into contact with society's most cultured and refined individuals instead became a gauntlet of exploitation that left lasting scars on their ability to form genuine human connections. Behind the elegant facades of the Okiya houses, where visitors glimpsed only carefully arranged reception rooms adorned with precious scrolls and gleaming lacquerware, lay a labyrinth of cramped sleeping quarters that housed the geisha like silk-wrapped prisoners in cells designed for maximum economy rather than human comfort. The apprentices and junior geisha slept in rooms barely large enough to accommodate their futons when unrolled, the thin straw mats providing little cushioning against the hard wooden floors, while paper-thin walls ensured that every whispered conversation, every muffled sob, and every restless movement became part of a communal symphony of suppressed humanity. The elaborate kimono and precious ornaments that created their public personas hung from pegs driven into walls so close together that dressing required careful choreography to avoid damaging the silk garments that represented their house's most valuable investments, while personal possessions were limited to what could fit in small wooden chests that served as both storage and makeshift seating in the confined spaces. The communal nature of their living arrangements meant that privacy became a luxury more precious than the finest silk, as bathing, dressing, and even personal hygiene were conducted under the watchful eyes of house mothers and fellow residents who had learned to view surveillance as protection and isolation as punishment. The single bathing area served dozens of women, its small wooden tub requiring careful scheduling that often meant the junior members waited until the water had grown cold and murky from the ablutions of their seniors, while the limited hot water meant that cleanliness often competed with the need to preserve heat for the more valued residents. Personal correspondence, if permitted at all, was read by house mothers before delivery, while the few precious moments of solitude were constantly interrupted by summons for lessons, fittings, or household duties that prevented any opportunity for genuine reflection or emotional processing. The architecture of control extended beyond mere physical constraints to encompass every aspect of daily existence, as the geisha learned that even their sleeping positions were subject to regulation designed to preserve their elaborate hairstyles and prevent wrinkles that might affect their marketability. They slept with their necks supported by small wooden blocks rather than pillows, their heads positioned to maintain the complex arrangements that had taken hours to create and could not be easily reproduced, while their bodies remained rigidly positioned to avoid disturbing the careful placement of their night garments. The narrow spaces between sleeping areas meant that the slightest movement by one resident could disturb her neighbors, creating an environment where natural rest became another form of performance, requiring constant awareness of one's impact on others. Perhaps most psychologically damaging was the way these cramped conditions prevented the formation of genuine personal space that might have served as refuge from the constant demands of their profession, their entire existence unfolding in areas that belonged to the house rather than to themselves. The lack of any corner that could be claimed as truly private meant that authentic self-expression became impossible, as every gesture and every possession remained subject to inspection and judgment by authority figures whose approval determined their daily comfort and long-term survival. Thus, these women who created beauty and refinement for others lived in conditions that would have been considered inadequate for servants, their personal dignity sacrificed to maintain the economic efficiency of enterprises that valued their output over their humanity. In the austere dining chambers where sustenance was measured with the precision of a pharmacist preparing medicine, Geisha learned that hunger was not merely the absence of food, but a constant companion that must be embraced as essential to achieving the ethereal slenderness that clients equated with feminine perfection. The house mothers, themselves products of the same systematic starvation that had shaped their own skeletal frames, doled out portions of rice and vegetables with the calculating eyes of merchants weighing precious metals. Each grain counted against the potential profit that a properly maintained figure might generate. The ideal geisha body resembled a willow branch more than a healthy woman, her ribs visible beneath silk undergarments, while her face maintained the gaunt beauty of perpetual fasting, disguised as refinement. Her movements possessing the fragile grace of someone who existed always on the edge of physical collapse, yet somehow continued to perform with supernatural elegance. The psychological warfare waged against natural appetite began in childhood and intensified with each passing year, as apprentices learned to view their own hunger as weakness and food as enemy rather than nourishment, their relationships with sustenance becoming so distorted that the simple act of eating triggered waves of guilt and self-loathing that could persist for days. The house mothers spoke with religious conviction about the spiritual purity achieved through denial of bodily needs, explaining how the transcendence of earthly desires elevated their charges above common women who remained slaves to appetite and physical comfort. Meals became rituals of measured deprivation, where each bite was evaluated for its necessity rather than enjoyed for its flavor, while the women learned to find satisfaction in the hollow sensation of empty stomachs rather than the contentment that should have followed proper nourishment. The competitive atmosphere among the geisha intensified these destructive patterns, as women who had already achieved the prescribed thinness continued to restrict their intake in hopes of gaining advantages over rivals whose figures might be deemed less perfect by clients whose preferences could change with the seasons. Secret comparisons of waist measurements and arm circumferences became obsessions that consumed mental energy that should have been devoted to artistic development, while the sight of food triggered calculations about its potential impact on their marketability rather than appreciation for its nutritional value or sensory pleasure. The few who attempted to maintain healthier eating habits found themselves subjected to subtle pressure from both house mothers and fellow residents who had internalized the belief that suffering was essential to achieving the aesthetic standards their profession demanded. The long-term consequences of this systematic malnutrition manifested in bodies that aged prematurely, despite the elaborate skincare regimens designed to preserve their beauty, their bones becoming brittle from calcium deficiency, while their immune systems weakened from chronic undernourishment that left them vulnerable to illnesses that would have been easily overcome by properly nourished women. The irony was devastating. In their pursuit of the perfect feminine form, they systematically destroyed the very health and vitality that should have been beauty's foundation, creating ethereal creatures whose otherworldly appearance was achieved through the gradual elimination of everything that made them fully human. Thus, the most beautiful women in Japanese society became walking advertisements for the deadly consequences of pursuing an aesthetic ideal that confused suffering with beauty and starvation with refinement. Beneath the porcelain perfection of their painted faces, where white powder concealed not only natural skin, but the ravages of psychological torment that no cosmetic art could truly hide, Geisha carried burdens of despair that would have broken less rigorously trained souls, their smiles becoming masks more impenetrable than any theater performer had ever worn. The constant suppression of authentic emotion in favor of manufactured pleasantness created internal pressure that built like steam in a sealed vessel, threatening to explode in moments when the carefully constructed facades could no longer contain the accumulated anguish of years spent denying their own humanity. The house mothers, recognizing the danger that emotional breakdown posed to their investments, developed sophisticated methods for detecting the early signs of psychological collapse, while simultaneously training their charges to bury their distress so deeply that even they began to lose touch with their genuine feelings beneath the layers of professional performance. The isolation from natural human connections, combined with the constant pressure to maintain impossible standards of beauty and grace, created conditions perfectly suited to the development of profound melancholy that permeated their existence like incense smoke, invisible yet inescapable. Many geisha developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe depression, their minds trapped in cycles of self-recrimination and hopelessness that no amount of artistic achievement could alleviate, while others retreated into forms of dissociation that allowed them to perform their duties while their consciousness fled to protected spaces where their true selves could remain untouched by the daily humiliations of their profession. The few who attempted to seek help or express their psychological distress found themselves dismissed as ungrateful or weak, their suffering interpreted as character flaws rather than natural responses to systematic abuse and exploitation. The competitive atmosphere and constant surveillance that defined their daily existence prevented the formation of supportive relationships that might have provided emotional relief, as trust became a luxury they could not afford in a world where confidences could be weaponized and vulnerability could be exploited by rivals seeking advantages in the endless struggle for patronage and survival. Sleep offered little respite from their psychological torment, as nightmares filled with images of endless servitude and impossible demands invaded their rest, while the physical discomfort of sleeping in positions designed to preserve their elaborate hairstyles ensured that even unconsciousness provided no true escape from the prison of their existence. The rare moments of solitude that might have allowed for emotional processing were constantly interrupted by demands for lessons, performances, or household duties that prevented any opportunity for genuine self-reflection or healing. Perhaps most devastating was the way their professional training gradually eroded their ability to distinguish between genuine emotions and performed responses, as years of manufacturing appropriate feelings for clients left many geisha uncertain about their authentic psychological states, their inner worlds becoming as artificial and calculated as their public personas. The prescription medications that might have provided relief were either unavailable or viewed with suspicion by house mothers who feared that altered mental states might affect performance quality, while traditional remedies proved inadequate for addressing the complex psychological damage caused by systematic dehumanization, disguised as artistic training. Thus, these women who had achieved mastery of Japan's most refined cultural expressions often found themselves strangers to their own emotional landscapes, their painted smiles hiding depths of despair that no art form could adequately express or heal. Within the paper-walled chambers where discipline was administered with the same calculated precision applied to artistic instruction, the house mothers wielded systems of punishment that could break the spirit without leaving visible marks that might damage their valuable investments. Their methods refined through generations of experience in maintaining absolute control over women whose compliance was essential to profitability. The bamboo switches that hung beside the mirrors in practice rooms served as constant reminders of the price of imperfection, their swift descent upon exposed skin creating welts that would be hidden beneath layers of silk, while the pain lingered as a lesson in the consequences of failing to meet impossible standards. The physical violence, while brutal, was carefully calibrated to avoid permanent injury that might affect performance quality, each blow administered with the cold precision of a craftsman, shaping recalcitrant material into the desired form, while the victims learned to accept pain as the natural consequence of their own inadequacy rather than evidence of systematic abuse. The more sophisticated punishments involved the manipulation of social relationships and basic comforts, as disobedient geisha found themselves excluded from the informal networks of support that made their harsh existence bearable. Their fellow residents instructed to treat them as invisible until their attitudes improved sufficiently to warrant readmission to the community. Food portions were reduced to starvation levels for extended periods. Sleep was interrupted by unnecessary summons for additional training or household duties, and access to heating during winter months was withdrawn until the offender demonstrated proper submission to authority. The house mothers understood that isolation was often more effective than violence in breaking rebellious spirits, as human beings required social connection to maintain psychological stability, and the withdrawal of even basic acknowledgement of their existence could drive the strongest personalities to desperate pleas for forgiveness. Perhaps most devastating were the punishments that targeted the geisha's professional development and future prospects, as house mothers could destroy years of progress with decisions about training opportunities, performance bookings, and introductions to important clients that determined whether their charges would achieve success or languish in obscurity forever. A single act of defiance could result in assignment to the least prestigious venues, exclusion from seasonal festivals that provided opportunities for advancement, or reduction in the quality of kimono and ornaments that signaled status to potential patrons. The most severe cases involved complete exile from the pleasure quarters, a form of social death that left the offender without marketable skills or social connections, condemned to lives of poverty and degradation that served as warnings to others who might consider challenging the established order. The psychological manipulation underlying these punishment systems proved most insidious of all, as the house mothers convinced their victims that their suffering resulted from personal failures rather than systematic oppression, transforming punishment into education and abuse into character development. The women learned to internalize the logic of their oppressors, viewing their own resistance as selfishness that threatened the welfare of the entire house, while gratitude for basic necessities replaced righteous anger at their exploitation. Thus, the punishment systems achieved their ultimate goal of creating willing participants in their own subjugation. Women who would eventually become house mothers themselves and perpetuate the same cycles of violence and control that had shaped their existence, believing themselves to be preserving tradition rather than maintaining a profitable enterprise built upon the systematic destruction of human dignity. In the deepest hours of night, when temple bells tolled across sleeping districts, and only the soft whisper of wind through paper screens disturbed the silence, a few desperate souls would gather courage born from desperation and attempt what seemed impossible: escape from the golden cages that had shaped their entire existence. These rare acts of rebellion required months of careful planning, as the women hoarded fragments of information about the outside world, concealed small amounts of money when possible, and studied the patterns of surveillance that governed their daily lives in search of moments when watchful eyes might be turned elsewhere. The preparation alone was fraught with danger, as discovery of escape plans would result in punishments so severe that many who attempted flight were never seen again by their former sisters, their fate serving as unspoken warnings about the price of challenging the system that owned them. Those who managed to slip past the guards and disappear into the labyrinthine streets of the cities faced challenges that would have tested the most resourceful individuals, their refined appearance and distinctive mannerisms marking them as clearly as brands upon cattle, while their complete lack of practical skills left them helpless in a world that demanded abilities they had never been permitted to develop. Their soft hands had never known manual labor. Their delicate constitutions could not withstand the physical demands of common work, and their educated speech patterns immediately identified them as refugees from the pleasure quarters to anyone who heard them speak. The few legitimate employers who might have offered work were warned away by agents of the houses, who maintained networks of informants throughout the surrounding areas, specifically to track and recapture their escaped property. The tragic irony lay in the fact that successful escape often led to circumstances far worse than the servitude they had fled, as these women of extraordinary beauty and refinement became targets for predators who understood their vulnerability and lack of protection outside the structured environment of their former captivity. Many found themselves forced into prostitution of the crudest sort, their artistic skills worthless in markets that valued only physical availability, while others fell victim to criminals who used their desperation to manipulate them into situations that made their former lives seem luxurious by comparison. The streets that had seemed to promise freedom became hunting grounds, where their refined beauty attracted the attention of men whose intentions were far more brutal than any client they had entertained in the tea houses. The few who achieved some measure of genuine freedom often discovered that their years of conditioning had left them psychologically incapable of functioning in normal society. Their capacity for independent decision-making so thoroughly eroded that the simplest choices became overwhelming challenges that paralyzed them with uncertainty. The constant surveillance and control that had defined their existence had created learned helplessness so profound that liberation became another form of torture. While the social skills that had served them well in the artificial environment of the pleasure quarters proved useless or even counterproductive in authentic human relationships. Most tragic of all were those who achieved temporary freedom only to voluntarily return to their houses after discovering that the world beyond offered nothing but different forms of exploitation without even the veneer of cultural refinement that had made their captivity bearable. As the winds of modernization swept across the ancient islands, like typhoons reshaping familiar coastlines, the Geisha discovered that the world they had known since childhood was dissolving beneath their feet, with the inexorable persistence of waves eroding stone foundations. The traditional arts that had once commanded reverence and substantial payment from cultured patrons were increasingly viewed as quaint relics by a society that had become infatuated with Western innovations and mechanical marvels, their shamisen music competing with phonographs, and their elegant dances overshadowed by motion pictures that offered entertainment without the expense and social complexity of traditional arrangements. The merchants and nobles who had once competed for their favors began to prefer the modern cafes and dance halls where younger women offered companionship without the elaborate protocols and astronomical costs associated with geisha entertainment, while the new generation of wealthy men sought to display their sophistication through European fashions and Western customs rather than knowledge of classical Japanese arts. The economic foundations that had supported the pleasure quarters for centuries crumbled as rapidly as ancient temples demolished to make way for telegraph lines and railway stations. The carefully balanced system of patronage and artistic exchange rendered obsolete by social changes that valued efficiency over elegance and innovation over tradition. The elaborate kimono that had once represented the pinnacle of artistic achievement became symbols of backwardness in a society rushing to embrace foreign styles, while the complex social rituals that had governed interactions between geisha and clients were dismissed as unnecessary complications by men who preferred the straightforward transactions available in establishments that made no pretense of cultural refinement. The house mothers watched in horror as their investments in training and maintaining traditional artists yielded diminishing returns, their beautiful charges becoming expensive anachronisms in a world that no longer valued the subtleties they had spent decades perfecting. The younger generation of women who might once have been drawn to the artistic life of the geisha were increasingly attracted to new opportunities in factories, offices, and shops that offered wages without the crushing debts and social restrictions that defined traditional service, while those who remained in the pleasure quarters found themselves competing not only with each other but with an entirely different category of entertainment that required no artistic training or cultural knowledge. The telegraph, telephone, and railroad that connected distant regions also brought news of different ways of life that made the isolated world of the geisha seem increasingly provincial and constrained, while the foreign visitors who arrived with these modern innovations often displayed bewilderment rather than appreciation when confronted with the elaborate rituals and artistic displays that had once been sources of national pride. Perhaps most devastating was the gradual recognition that their entire way of life had become a curiosity rather than a cultural treasure. Their refined skills transformed from essential accomplishments into museum pieces that tourists might observe with polite interest before moving on to more exciting modern attractions. The geisha, who had sacrificed everything to achieve mastery of traditional arts, found themselves performing not for connoisseurs who understood and valued their expertise, but for audiences who viewed them as living embodiments of a vanishing past. Their profound knowledge and spiritual discipline reduced to exotic entertainment for people who could never appreciate the depth of learning and sacrifice their performances represented. Thus, modernization achieved what centuries of social upheaval had not, transforming these guardians of cultural tradition into beautiful ghosts haunting a world that had moved beyond their understanding. From the moment they opened their eyes each dawn until they closed them in exhausted surrender to sleep, geisha lived within an elaborate theatrical production where every gesture, every expression, every breath was choreographed to embody an impossible ideal of feminine perfection that bore no resemblance to the complex human beings trapped within these living performances. Their training had systematically eliminated every trace of natural behavior in favor of movements so refined and artificial that spontaneity became a form of professional failure, while their voices were modulated to produce only the musical tones deemed appropriate for their elevated status as living embodiments of cultural beauty. The simple act of walking required conscious attention to the precise angle of each step, the exact positioning of hands and shoulders, and the careful arrangement of facial features into expressions of serene contentment that must be maintained regardless of their internal emotional state or physical discomfort. The performance extended far beyond mere physical deportment to encompass every aspect of personality and emotional response, as genuine feelings were viewed as crude interruptions of the aesthetic perfection their clients expected to purchase along with their artistic skills. Anger, sadness, frustration, or any emotion that might disturb the carefully crafted atmosphere of refined pleasure was ruthlessly suppressed in favor of practiced responses that served the needs of others while denying the validity of their own human experiences. The house mothers trained them to manufacture appropriate reactions to every conceivable situation, creating women who could appear delighted by tedious conversation, fascinated by repeated stories, and charmed by behavior that privately disgusted them. Their authentic selves buried so deeply beneath layers of performance that many lost touch with their genuine preferences and opinions entirely. The tragedy lay in the gradual erosion of the boundary between performance and identity, as years of systematic suppression of authentic behavior created women who could no longer distinguish between their professional personas and whatever remained of their original personalities beneath the accumulated artifice. They learned to laugh with perfect timing at unfunny jokes, to express interest in subjects that bored them, and to radiate warmth toward people they found repulsive. Their capacity for genuine emotional response slowly atrophying from disuse, while their ability to manufacture convincing facsimiles of feeling reached levels of sophistication that would have impressed the greatest actresses. The most successful among them became so skilled at reading the desires of their audiences that they could adjust their personalities moment by moment to match changing expectations, becoming human chameleons whose only consistent trait was their ability to transform into whatever others wished them to be. Perhaps most devastating was the realization that this perpetual performance had consumed so much of their existence that retirement or escape offered no relief, as the women who had devoted their lives to embodying artificial femininity discovered they had lost access to whatever authentic selves might have existed before their transformation began. The few who achieved freedom found themselves unable to make simple decisions about personal preferences because they had no experience with genuine choice. Their identities so thoroughly constructed around the needs and desires of others that solitude became a terrifying confrontation with emptiness rather than an opportunity for self-discovery. Thus, these masters of feminine performance became strangers to their own femininity, their expertise in embodying cultural ideals having required the sacrifice of everything that might have made them genuinely human women rather than beautiful automatons designed for the pleasure of men who confused artificial perfection with authentic beauty. In the twilight years of their service, when the mirror's reflection revealed faces that no amount of powder could restore to their former ethereal beauty, Geisha confronted the most terrifying prospect their profession offered, a future as uncertain and bleak as winter shadows stretching across abandoned gardens. The gradual decline of their earning power created a cruel mathematics of survival, as house mothers calculated the point at which maintaining aging performers would cost more than their diminished abilities could generate, their decades of loyal service weighing nothing against the cold logic of profit margins that had always governed their existence. The women who had sacrificed their youth, health, and humanity in pursuit of artistic perfection discovered that their accumulated wisdom and hard-won skills were valued primarily as training tools for the next generation, their role shifting from featured performers to background instructors whose compensation barely covered their basic needs. The fortunate few who had managed to accumulate savings, despite the crushing debt systems that had governed their careers, faced the challenge of learning to navigate a world for which their entire training had left them supremely unprepared. Their refined skills useless in markets that demanded practical abilities they had never been permitted to develop. Those without financial reserves found themselves trapped in positions of dependency that extended their servitude indefinitely, as the houses that had profited from their prime years offered minimal support in exchange for continued teaching duties that kept them bound to the very system that had consumed their lives. The irony was devastating. Women who had mastered the most sophisticated arts of their culture possessed no practical knowledge of commerce, household management, or the countless mundane skills that ordinary people took for granted. Their education having been so specialized that it left them helpless outside the narrow confines of their profession. The social isolation that had defined their careers became even more pronounced in retirement, as former geisha found themselves occupying a strange, liminal space between the respectable world they had never been permitted to enter and the pleasure quarters where they no longer belonged as active participants. Their families, if any remained alive, often viewed them as strangers whose refined mannerisms and expensive tastes marked them as outsiders to the simple lives their relatives had continued to live, while the broader society regarded them with a mixture of fascination and suspicion that made genuine friendship nearly impossible to achieve. The few who attempted to form romantic relationships discovered that their professional history created barriers that no amount of personal charm could overcome, as potential suitors were either intimidated by their sophisticated past or attracted primarily by fantasies that had little connection to their authentic selves. Perhaps most tragic of all was the way their final years served as living warnings to the younger women still trapped within the system, their visible decline providing concrete evidence of the ultimate futility of the sacrifices being demanded from new generations of apprentices who might otherwise have harbored illusions about the rewards awaiting those who achieved success in their chosen profession. The elderly geisha who survived to old age often became cautionary tales rather than respected elders, their accumulated wisdom dismissed as the bitter ramblings of women whose lives had been wasted in pursuit of beauty that had proven as ephemeral as cherry blossoms in a spring storm. Thus, the cycle completed itself, as those who had devoted their entire existence to embodying cultural ideals finished their days as reminders of the price such devotion demanded, their twilight years offering no comfort or dignity to compensate for the profound losses they had endured in service to a system that discarded them as soon as their usefulness expired. And so we come to understand that behind the painted masks and silk-wrapped dreams of feudal Japan's most celebrated entertainers lay a reality far more complex and troubling than the romanticized tales would have us believe. The geisha, those seemingly ethereal beings who floated through history like living works of art, were in truth prisoners of a system that transformed human souls into commodities, their beauty purchased through suffering that echoed across generations. In their stories, we glimpse the profound cost of a society that confused ownership with appreciation, performance with authenticity, and the systematic destruction of individual identity with the preservation of cultural tradition.